Book 14. Glaucus, who'd left Euboea for life in the swell of the ocean, had now passed Aetna, the mountain piled on the throat of the giant Typhon. He'd passed the fields of the Cyclops, which never had known the working of harrow or plow, and owed no debt to yoked oxen. He'd passed Messana and also the walls of Rhegium, opposite, finding his way through the dangerous strait where the waters are bounded by Italy's soil on the one side and Sicily's coast on the other. Thence powerfully swimming across the Etruscan Sea, he arrived at the herb-green hills and the halls of Circe, the sun-god's daughter, halls that were crowded with various beasts. Once he had seen her, and greetings had been exchanged, the guest appealed to his hostess. "Goddess, I pray you, pity a god. You alone can lighten this longing of mine. If you will, but judge me worth your compassion. Titanus, no one knows the power of herbs and grasses better than I, for my transformation was due to their magic. But let me tell you the cause of the passion raging inside me. On Italy's coast, where it faces the walls of Messana, I saw her. I saw my Scylla. Shame forbids me to tell you the promises, prayers, and wheedling words I employed to be cruelly rejected. O Circe, if spells can hold any sway, now open those holy lips to utter a spell. Or if herbs will be more effectual, use the proven power of a herb, which will do what is needed. I do not ask to be cured myself, or my wound to be healed, or an end to my love, but for Scylla to share the heat of my passion." Circe, however, possessed a heart more open than others to love's strong flames. It might have been her own nature, or caused by Venus, who'd never forgotten that Circe's father, the sun god, betrayed her affair with Mars. And so she responded to Glaucus. "You'd do far better to follow a woman whose wishes and prayers are at one with your own, whose heart is fired by an equal passion. You deserved to be actively wooed for yourself. You could have been, surely. Offer some hope, and believe me, you shall be wooed without wooing. To banish all doubt and distrust you may have in your power to attract, look into my eyes. I may be a goddess, the daughter born to the gleaming sun. The power of my spells and my herbs may be great, but I pray that I may be yours. Reject the one who rejects you. Respond to her who pursues you, and give two women at once the payment you owe them." To these advances Glaucus replied, "While Scylla is living, my love for her will not alter, till foliage grows in the ocean and seaweed sprouts on the peaks of the mountains." The goddess was deeply offended. She couldn't do mischief to Glaucus. Moreover, she loved him too well, but she vented her spleen on the girl he preferred to herself. Enraged because he had scorned her attentions, she promptly pounded together some plants which were noxious with sinister juices, and chanted the spells of her witchcraft over the mixture. Then donning a sea-blue cloak, she grandly advanced through the throng of her fawning beasts as she went on her way from the heart of the palace. She made for Rhegium, over the strait from the rocks of Messana, and there she walked on the seething waves of a stormy sea, as though it were solid land, and skimmed the surface with dry feet. Picture a little pool, with its margin curved like a bow, where Scylla delighted to rest. It was here she would find a retreat from the fury of sea and the sky, when the noonday sunbeams were burning most fiercely and shadows were shortest. This pool was polluted by Circe beforehand. She fouled it with monster-producing poisons by sprinkling the juice from a baleful root, as she darkly muttered her magical spell thrice 9 times over, in mazy, mysterious language. Scylla arrived at the pool and had stepped in up to the waist, when she saw that her loins were disfigured by horrible barking creatures. At first she had no idea that these formed part of her body, and shrank to the side in fear as she tried to repel the importunate, snapping intruders, but merely dragged at what she was fleeing. She frantically felt for the flesh of her thighs, her legs, and her feet, but all that she'd found was a cluster of galloping hellhounds. She'd nothing to stand on but rabid dogs whose bestial back she was holding in check beneath her truncated loins and protuberant belly. Glaucus, her lover, wept. Fair Circe had been so malicious in using the magical power of her herbs, and he spurned her embraces. Scylla remained where she was and took the first chance she was given to show her hatred for Circe by grabbing Ulysses' companions. Later on, she would also have drowned the ships of the Trojans, had she not first been changed to a headland of rock which still stands there to this day and is shunned by sailors as carefully as ever. The Trojans had deftly maneuvered their ships past Scylla's rock and Charybdis's whirlpool, and now were almost approaching Italian shores, when a storm diverted them south to the coast of Africa. There they were taken to hearth and heart by Sidonian Dido, who found Aeneas' sudden departure a cruel separation. She built a funeral pyre on false religious pretenses, and fell on her sword, so cheating the world as she had been cheated. In backward flight from the new city walls on the sandy coast, Aeneas returned to his friend Acestes at Eryx to offer sacrifice where his father had died and to honor the grave. When the fleet had almost been burnt by Iris at Juno's bidding, the Trojans set sail once more. They passed the Aeolian Islands, where sulphurous smoke pours out of the earth, then the rocks of the Sirens. Aeneas' ship was deprived of his helmsman, the drowned Palinurus, but soon it was skirting Inarame, Procate, past Pithecusae, placed on a barren hill and called Ape Town from the people who lived there. They'd once been known as Cercopians. Later, however, Jupiter changed them to misshaped creatures because he detested their lying, deceitful ways, and the treacherous crimes they'd committed. He wanted them both to be different from men and resemble them too, so he shortened their limbs and flattened their noses. He furrowed their faces with elderly wrinkles. He covered their bodies completely in tawny hair. Then he set them to live on this island. But first he denied them the use of their tongues and words to utter their dreadful perjuries. All that remained was their power of complaining in raucous screeches. When he'd passed this place to the right, and Parthenopes' city of Naples, Aeneas arrived on the shores of the marshy region of Cumae, and entered the cave of the long-lived Sibyl. His prayer was to traverse the underworld kingdom in order to visit the shade of his father. The prophetess held her gaze long fixed on the earth, till she raised her head as her soul was possessed by the god, and finally uttered in frenzy, "You ask great things, you greatest of heroes, whose valor was proved by your sword in the fray, and whose love as a son and a father was tested by fire. But, noble Trojan, you need not be troubled. Your prayer shall be granted, and I shall guide you to Pluto's realm, where you'll see the Elysian fields and meet your father's dear spirit. No path is closed to the virtuous man." So speaking, she showed him a golden bough which gleamed on a tree in Proserpina's forest, and told him to break it off from the trunk. Aeneas obeyed her, and so was allowed to descend and set eyes on the wealth of the awesome god of the dead, on his own forefathers, and lastly the ghost of aged Anchises, the great of heart, who taught him the laws which govern Avernus, and also the dangers facing his people in wars to come. Thence, wearily climbing the uphill track to the earth, he lighted the tiring journey in talk with the Sibyl, and while he was plodding his fearful way through the murky twilight, he said to his guide from Cumae, "You may be truly a goddess, or merely beloved of the gods, but by me you shall always be counted a spirit divine, and I shall owe it to your consent that I came to the land of the dead, and returned thence after I'd seen it. For these great mercies, when I am restored to the air above, I shall build you a sacred temple, and pay you the tribute of incense." The Sibyl turned to Aeneas, and heaving a deep sigh, said to him, Goddess, I never have been, and a mortal creature may not be accorded the tribute of holy incense. Yet ignorance must not lead you astray. Eternal life was there for the taking, if only I'd offered my maidenhood up to the love of Apollo. But while he hoped that I'd yield and desired to seduce me with gifts, he said to me, Maiden of Cumae, now choose what you wish to be yours, and your wish shall be granted. I showed him a pile of dust that I'd gathered, and foolishly asked for my birthdays to equal the number of sand grains, failing also to ask that those years should always be youthful. Yet Phoebus agreed and offered perpetual youth as well, if I'd let him enjoy my body. I spurned his gift, and remain forever a virgin unwedded. But now the joy of my springtime is past, and weak old age with its trembling gait is upon me, age to be long endured. I have lived 700 years, but still have to see 300 harvests and seasons of vintage to equal the number of grains in the pile. The time will arrive when the length of days shall shrink my body from all it has been to a tiny frame, and my age-worn limbs be reduced to the weight of a feather. Then no one will ever believe that I once was adored and desired by a god. Yes, even Phoebus may fail to recall me, or else he'll deny that he loved me. So changed, so invisible, yet the fates will leave me with my voice, the voice by which men will know me. Mounting the slope to the earth, the Sibyl recounted her history, until they emerged from the Stygian world in the township of Cumae, where Trojan Aeneas offered the sacrifice due to the gods. Next, he put into shore at the place which was not yet called by the name of his faithful nurse. Another person who'd stopped there, after many exhausting adventures, was Ithacan Macareus, once a seasoned companion of much-enduring Ulysses. Macareus spotted a friend, Achaemenides, there with the Trojans, someone abandoned long since by the Greeks on the rocks of Mount Aetna, but rescued and taken on board by Aeneas. Astonished at suddenly finding his former companion alive, "What chance or what god has preserved you?" he said to his old friend. "How can a Greek be permitted to sail in a Trojan vessel? What land are you heading for now?" So Macareus asked. Achaemenides answered, no longer apparelled in hairy clothing fastened by thorns, once more his own master. "Listen, I'd rather remain on this ship than return to my home in Ithaca. Force me to see Polyphemus again, with his jaws all dripping with human blood, if I'm telling a lie. I swear that I hold Aeneas in greater respect than I hold my father. I'll never be able to thank him enough, whatever I give him. I speak and I breathe. I can see the sky and the sun's bright rays. Could I fail to be grateful for that, or ever forget what I owe him? It's due to him that my life didn't vanish inside the mouth of the Cyclops. If death overtakes me now, I shall still be properly buried, at least not swallowed inside the maw of that monster. What were my feelings, except that fear had deprived me entirely of feeling and sense, when I saw you heading out to the deep and was left behind? I wanted to shout for your help, but I dared not give my position away. The shouts of Ulysses had almost destroyed your vessel. I watched Polyphemus tear an enormous piece of rock from the mountain and cast it into the waves. I watched him hurling a second boulder. His giant's arm had a catapult's power. I was desperately frightened the ship would be sunk by the wind gust caused by the rock or the backward wash of a wave, and forgot that I wasn't on board. But when your rowing had saved you from certain death, the Cyclops stumbled over Mount Aetna groaning, groping his way through the woods and blindly bumping against the boulders. Stretching his gore-fouled arms in the ocean's direction, he cursed the whole Grecian race as he wildly exclaimed, "How I wish some chance would return me Ulysses or one of his comrades, on whom my anger could rage, whose guts I'd devour and whose living body I'd tear apart, whose blood could flood the path to my gullet, whose limbs would quiver beneath my teeth as I crunched them. With that, the loss of my sight would count for little or nothing." All that, and more in his fury, while I turned pale in a seizure of horror, my gaze transfixed by the face still dripping with gore, the violent hands and the sightless eye, the gargantuan limbs and the beard all matted with human blood. Yes, death was before me. But that was the least of my terrors. I thought he was going to seize me, going at once to down my vitals inside his own. And the picture stuck in my mind of the awful time when I'd seen him grabbing my comrades, 2 at a time, and repeatedly dashing their heads on the floor, then crouching lion-like over their bodies to swallow the flesh and the guts, the bones full of succulent marrow, the limbs still pulsing with life down into that ravening belly. I quivered like them and stood there, bloodless in grief, as I watched them, chewing and spewing his bloody feast and vomiting gobbets of flesh in a splutter of neat wine. That was the fate I imagined awaited me during those many days when I lurked in my hideout, trembling at every noise, both frightened and longing to die. With acorns, grasses, and leaves I kept starvation at bay, helpless, hopeless, and lonely, abandoned to death and to hardship. Then, after a long, long time, I sighted this ship in the distance. I waved my arms in a plea to be rescued. I ran to the shore, and I moved their pity. A Greek was taken on board by Trojans. Macareus, dearest of friends, now tell me your own adventures. What of our leader Ulysses, and what of the crew who were with you? Macareus first explained how Ulysses had visited Aeolus, lord of the Tuscan sea, who confines the winds in their prison. To hasten his homeward voyage, the king had made him a special present of all the winds tied firmly up in an ox skin. For 9 whole days they had sailed with a favoring breeze behind them, and Ithaca now was in sight. But on the following morning, Ulysses' companions were overcome by rapacious envy. Thinking the skin carried gold, they untied the strings and released the winds, which immediately swept their ship back over the sea they had recently crossed and drove them again into Aeolus' harbor. From there, Macareus continued, we sailed to the ancient city of Laestrygonian Lamus, where King Antiphates ruled. I, with 2 others, was sent to see him, but out of the 3 of us, 1 companion and I succeeded in fleeing to safety. The other was caught in Antiphates' cannibal jaws and colored them red with his blood. We were chased by the king and a crowd of excited people behind him, who gathered and pelted the ships of Ulysses with rocks and with branches, sinking the vessels and drowning the crews. 1 ship, however, escaped, the one which was carrying me and Ulysses himself. In distress at losing the bulk of our comrades and sadly lamenting our lot, we finally came to the island you see in the distance from here. I've been there myself, and believe me, it's better observed from a distance. I warn you, most righteous of Trojans, son of a goddess, the war is over, Aeneas, I cannot call you a foe. Stay firmly away from the island of Circe. We too, after mooring our ship on the shore of that dangerous island, remembered Antiphates, not to mention the brutal Cyclops, and so we refused to go on, or to enter the house of a stranger. But lots were cast, and a party consisting of me and the faithful Polites, Eurylochus, boozy Elpenor, with 18 others, was chosen to venture away from the shore into the palace of Circe. As soon as we reached it and stood on the threshold, we cowered in terror, from hundreds of wolves, lionesses, and she-bears rushing to greet us, though none, in fact, gave cause for alarm or was likely to hurt us. Far from it, they were all wagging their tails in the friendliest fashion, and licking our hands as we moved indoors, until we were welcomed by female attendants, who guided us through a magnificent marble hall to their mistress's presence. The goddess was throned on a splendid chair in a beautiful apse and wearing a dazzling robe, wrapped around with a golden cloak. The nymphs and nereids by her weren't carding the wool of a fleece or spinning thread in their fingers, but sorting out grasses or neatly arranging a jumble of scattered flowers or herbs of various colors in separate baskets. Circe herself was directing the work, as she well understood the use of the different leaves and how they ought to be blended, keeping an eye on her women and checking the weight of each substance. As soon as she saw us and formal greetings had been exchanged, she graciously smiled and reciprocated our kind good wishes, then promptly ordered her nymphs to concoct a potion consisting of barley grains, honey, a powerful wine, and milk that had curdled. To this she added some juices which wouldn't be noticed in so much sweetness. We gladly accepted the cup from the goddess's hand as our lips were parched. But as soon as we'd swallowed the potion down, the sorceress touched the tops of our heads with her wand. In a moment, I tell the tale to my shame, I started to prickle all over with bristles. My voice had deserted me. All the words I could utter were snorting grunts. I was falling down to the earth, head first. I could feel my nose and my mouth going hard in a long, round snout. My neck was swelling in folds of muscle. The hands which had lifted the cup just now to my lips were marking the soil with hoofprints. Others had suffered the same. Those charms are so strong, and I joined them, pinned in a sty. We saw that we all had been turned into swine, except for Eurylochus. He alone had rejected the potion, and had he not done so, I'd still be one of a herd of bristly porkers today. Ulysses would never have learned from the man of this dreadful disaster and come to save us from Circe's enchantment. Luckily, Mercury, god of peace, had given our leader a flower which the gods call moly, a pure white flower with a black root. Armed with that and the god's instructions, Ulysses entered the palace of Circe, and when she offered her treacherous potion and tried to caress his hair with her wand, to her startled amazement, he violently pushed her away and frightened her off with his drawn sword. Solemn pledges were then exchanged. Ulysses was happy to join fair Circe in bed, but insisted that she must restore his friends to their normal shapes to fulfill her part of the bargain. And so we were sprinkled with juice from a strange but rather more wholesome herb, and firmly struck on the head with a blow from the other end of her wand, while a spell commuted her curse to a blessing. And while her chanting continued, our bodies gradually rose till we stood on our feet. Our bristles fell off, the cracks in our cloven trotters were gone, our shoulders returned, and we found we had upper arms, elbows, and forearms. Ulysses was weeping. We wept ourselves as we fondly embraced him and clung to his neck. The first of the new-found words that we uttered expressed our heartfelt thanks to our leader. We stayed in Circe's house for a year, and during that long time I was a witness to many sights and heard many stories. These included a tale which was told me in private by one of the 4 attendants whom Circe employed in her magical rites. One day, while her mistress was idly dawdling alone with Ulysses, this nice nymph showed me a statue, carved in the whitest of marble, portraying a man with a woodpecker perched on top of his head. The statue was set in a shrine and festooned with garlands. Curious to know, I inquired who the young man was and why he was worshipped there in the shrine, and why he carried that bird on his head. "I'll tell you, Macareus," answered the girl. "It's another example of Circe's magic, so please attend while I try to explain. Picus, the offspring of Saturn, was once the king in the land of Ausonia. Horses for battle and war were his passionate interest. This statue shows how he looked as a man. You can see for yourself how handsome he was and admire his mien on the strength of his portrait. His person was matched by his fineness of nature. He wasn't yet 20 and couldn't have watched the Olympics in Elis as many as 4 times. His wonderful looks attracted the dryads born in the mountains of Latium. The nymphs of the fountains sighed for him too, and the naiads who dwell in the Alban Tiber. the streams of Numitis or Anio, Almo, whose course is the shortest, cascading Nar, or the shady waters of Pharpha, and others whose haunts are Tauric Diana's woodland pool or the lakes nearby. But Picus rejected them all and courted a nymph whom Vanilia bore, so they say, long ages ago on the Palatine hill to two-headed Janus. As soon as this beautiful girl was old enough to be married, they gave her away to the favored suitor, Laurentian Picus. Though rare in beauty, in singing's arts she was rarer yet, so her name was Canens, the singer. She'd move the trees and the rocks, she'd calm the fiercest of beasts, she would slow the course of the longest rivers and halt the birds on the wing with her musical singing. One day when Canens was trilling at home in her lovely soprano, Picus went out to the fields of Laurentum to chase the boar. He was riding his mettled steed, 2 hunting spears in his left hand, wearing a scarlet cloak with a golden brooch on his shoulder. It chanced that Circe had also entered the woods at the same time, leaving the fields called after his name in order to gather new herbs on the fertile hills. As soon as she saw young Picus from where she was hidden inside a thicket, her breath was completely taken away. She dropped the herbs she had carefully gathered and felt the flames of passion pervading the whole of her being. Once the heat had subsided a little, and she had recovered her senses, she longed to confess her desire, but couldn't approach him because of his galloping horse and all of his thronging attendants. "The wind may snatch you away," she said, "but you shan't escape me, if only I know myself, if the magical power of my herbs hasn't vanished entirely, if all the spells I can chant don't fail me." So saying, she conjured up an illusion, a phantom boar, which she ordered to scamper across the trail in the king's full view, and appear to enter the wood where the trees were thickest. The ground was cluttered with fallen trunks, and a horse couldn't possibly pass through. Picus was fooled, and at once went after this ghost of a quarry. He quickly leapt to the ground from his foaming steed and wandered on foot through the depths of the wood in pursuit of an empty hope. Meanwhile, fair Circe was framing her prayers in sorcery's language, worshipping unknown gods in outlandish charms, which she commonly used to obscure the face of a silvery moon, or to weave a curtain of rain-sodden clouds beneath her father, the sun god. So it was then, as she chanted her spell, the heavens were darkened, mist steamed up from the earth, and all the king's followers blindly wandered and trailed through the wood, so that none was left to protect him. Circe now had contrived the time and the place for her ambush. "I appeal to you, Picus," she said, "by your eyes which have captured my own, by your beauty, most handsome of men, which compels me, though I am a goddess, to kneel at your feet. Be kind to my passion. Accept the all-seeing sun as your father. Don't cruelly scorn the Titaness Circe." But Picus firmly rejected both Circe herself and her prayers. "Whoever you are," he replied, "I cannot be yours, as another has captured and holds my heart in her keeping. I pray she retains it forever and ever. I cannot be false to the vows of my marriage, so long as the fates preserve me the daughter of Janus, my Canens." Circe appealed to Picus again many times to no purpose. "Your hardness will cost you dear," she exclaimed. "Your Canens shall never see you again. You'll learn what a woman in love who is injured can do, and Circe is surely an injured woman in love." The sorceress then turned twice to the west and twice to the east. She struck the young king with her wand 3 times, and she spoke 3 spells. Picus took to his heels, but soon was surprised to discover himself running faster than usual, Wings had sprung from his body. A new type of bird had suddenly joined the forests of Latium. Furious to find it was he pecked at the wild tree trunks with his hard beak, angrily dealing wounds in the length of the branches. His wings had taken the hue of his scarlet cloak, and the golden brooch with the pin which had gripped his garments was turned into plumage. His neck was ringed with a circle of golden yellow, and nothing remained of his former self but the name of the woodpecker, Picus. Meanwhile, the attendants of Picus, who'd frequently shouted in vain for their master over the countryside and had found him nowhere, came upon Circe, who'd cleared the sky by this time and permitted the mists to disperse in the sun and the wind. They plied her with questions, accused her of what she had actually done, and demanded their king back. Force was threatened. Their pointed swords were ready for action, when Circe sprinkled a noxious substance and poisonous juices upon them, summoning night and the powers of darkness from Chaos and Erebus, praying to Hecate, goddess of witchcraft, in drawn-out wailing and shrieks. Then, wonder of wonders, the woods all jumped. The earth gave a rumbling groan, and the trees in the glade turned yellow. The poison-bespattered grass was running with droplets of blood. It appeared that the rocks were hoarsely bellowing, dogs were barking, the earth was crawling with rough-scaled serpents as black as the night, and the air was filled with the flitting ghosts of the silent departed. The party of men was appalled by these hideous marvels. Then Circe touched their wondering faces of fear with her poisoned wand. They succumbed to her magic. The poor young men were transformed to a medley of monstrous beasts, and none of them kept his normal appearance. The fiery sun had set in the west on the shores of Tartessus. Canens was anxiously waiting and watching out for her husband, the king, but he hadn't returned. Search parties of servants and townsfolk scoured the forest in all directions with torches to find him. It wasn't enough for the nymph to be weeping or tearing her tresses or beating her breasts, though she did every one of those things, but she rushed right out of the palace and roamed distractedly over Latium. For 6 long days and for 6 long nights she traveled at random, without any food and without any sleep, through the hills and the valleys. She finally came to the Tiber, who saw her, exhausted by sorrow and all her travels, prostrating her limbs on the bank of his long stream. There, as she wept, she vented even her grief in an aria, sung in a soft, faint voice to express her despair, as we sometimes listen ourselves to the funeral dirge of the dying swan. In conclusion, her tender marrow was turned to water by morning. She wasted, and little by little she vanished away into nothing. Her fame, however, is marked by the spot which the ancient muses fitly called Canens, after the name of the musical nymph. Such were the many stories I heard and the sights that I saw in that tedious year. Doing nothing had made us sluggish and slow, when they told us to launch our vessels and spread our sails once again. Circe had warned that our purposed voyage would be long and uncertain, and I detailed the dangers still to be faced on the cruel sea. I was scared, I admit, and once I arrived in this country, I stayed. Macareus's story was ended. An urn with Aeneas's nurse's ashes was laid in a marble tomb, with this brief inscription: "Here lies Caeta. She nursed a hero renowned for his goodness. He saved her from Troy's great fire, and gave her the fire that he owed her." The cable which moored Aeneas's ship to a grassy embankment was now cast off. The sailors kept well away from the treacherous island and the palace of infamous Circe, and made for the woods where the yellow sands of the shady Tiber invade the ocean. And here Aeneas was given a home and pledged a daughter in marriage by Faunus's offspring Latinus, but not without conflict. A war broke out with a savage people, whose champion Turnus struggled with reckless fury to win the bride he'd been promised. Latium clashed with the whole of Etruria. Many an anxious day was spent in the heat of battle for hard-won victory. Each side was supported by help from abroad. The clans were gathered to back the Rutulians. Many defended the Trojan camp. Aeneas appealed with success to Evander, the king of Pallanteum. Venulus fared less well when he entered the walls of the exiled King Diomedes, who'd actually founded a spacious city and occupied land as a dowry from Iapygian Daunus. However, when Venulus boldly delivered his message from Turnus and asked for his aid, Diomedes flatly refused it and pleaded his weakness. He couldn't commit himself or the subjects of Daunus, his father-in-law, to a fight, and he had no men of his own Greek people to arm for a war. These aren't false pretexts, he added. I'll bring myself to explain, although my sadness and sorrow are reawakened when I recall them. Ilium's towers had been burnt to the ground and Troy devoured by the Grecian flames. Nereisian Ajax had brutally forced the virgin Cassandra away from the shrine of the virgin Athena and raped her, bringing on all of the Greeks the punishment owed to none but himself. So our fleet was scattered and forced by winds on the hostile ocean to face the lightning, the dark, and the rain, to endure the full fury of sea and of sky, and be finally wrecked on the rocks of Caphareus. I won't delay you by telling the whole sad story in detail, but Greece at that time might even have moved King Priam to tears. Though I was rescued and snatched from the waves through the care of the warrior goddess Athena, yet once again I was forced to abandon my father's estate in Argos, as kindly Venus remembered the wound I dealt her at Troy long ago, and made me atone for her injury now. I have lived through such great trials on the deep and in battles on land that I've often declared those others were lucky who perished beneath the waves by Caphareus's merciless cape in the storm which attacked us all, and wished I had gone down too. My companions had suffered all they could take on sea or in battle. Morale had collapsed, and they now demanded an end to their wanderings. But Acmon, whose hot-headed nature was chafed even more by disaster, protested. Sailors, he said, what's left to encounter that lies beyond your endurance to bear? What further damage can Venus inflict, supposing she wanted to? Prayers can avail if worse is yet to be feared. But when the worst has already occurred, fear lies at our feet, and the crown of misfortune is freedom from care. No matter if Venus can hear my words. Never mind if she loathes Diomedes' crew to a man. We can treat her loathing with scorn to a man. Her power may be great, but it counts for little with us. Such were the taunting words with which the insolent Acmon goaded the goddess and quickly revived her inveterate anger. More of his friends reproved him for what he had said than the few who agreed. When he tried to respond to our strictures, his voice grew thin as his throat grew thin. His hair was turned into feathers. His breast, his back, and his new-shaped neck were also covered with plumage. His arms expanded and bent at the elbows to form light wings. His toes disappeared in the rest of his large webbed feet, and his mouth went stiff as it hardened to horn and tapered into a sharp point. Lycus stared at Acmon in wonder, and so did Idas. So did Rhexenor, Nyctius, and Abas, and while they were staring, they all took on the same likeness. Most of my crew flew up from the ship and circled around the oars as they flapped their wings. If you ask what these strange new birds were like, I can only tell you that while they were different from swans, they resembled the swan very closely. The story explains why, although I can call King Daunus my father by marriage, this settlement takes some trouble to rule, and I plow these drought-stricken fields with a tiny remnant of people to help me. Thus far Diomedes. So Venulus left the Apulian kingdom and passed the Peucetian Gulf and Messapian fields. On his journey he sighted a cave, well shaded by woods and dripping with water, which now is the home of the half-goat Pan and once had belonged to the nymphs. One day these spirits were chased from their cave in a fright by a local shepherd, who scared them at first with his sudden arrival. But soon, when their courage returned and they saw that their doltish pursuer could well be ignored, they joined once more in their rhythmical dancing. The shepherd then jeered and jumped about in a crude imitation. What's more, he clownishly scoffed at their rites with obscene abuse. He never stopped shouting his insults until his mouth was obstructed by what he is now, by a tree, and the fruit will tell you its nature. The mark of his tongue survives in the bitter tang of wild olive berries. His roughness of language passed into tartness of flavor. After the envoys returned to Turnus and brought Diomedes' refusal to help, the Rutulians pressed ahead with their purposed war without his support. Much bloodshed followed on both sides. Suddenly Turnus attacked the pinewood ships of the Trojans with ravening torches, and timbers previously spared on the water now were threatened with fire. The flames were already at work on the pitch, the wax and the other combustible matter on board. They were mounting the lofty masts to the sails, and the benches crossing the rounded hulls were starting to smoke, when the thought occurred to Sibyl, known as the Holy Mother of all the gods, that the pine composing these ships had been felled on the peaks of Mount Ida. She filled the air with the clashing of cymbals and skirling of boxwood pipes. Then, riding across the sky in her lion-drawn chariot, "Turnus," she shouted, "you impious man, you are throwing those torches in vain. I will rescue those ships, as I cannot allow the consuming flames to devour any root or branch of my sacred forest." A clap of thunder as Sibyl spoke. Its rolling subsided. Then torrents of rain and of bouncing hailstones burst from the clouds. The storm wind suddenly clashed. Great chaos reigned in the sky, and over the swollen sea as the brothers engaged in their battle. The Earth Mother Goddess employed the strength of one of the gales to snap the hempen cables which moored the Phrygian vessels, to force the ships forward and plunge them all in the midst of the waves. As the wood in them gradually softened, the boats were changed into bodies, the rounded sterns were transformed into heads, and the oars vanished into the legs and toes of a swimmer. The sides continued as sides, and the keel down the middle below was altered to serve as a backbone. Rigging became soft hair, and arms appeared on the sail yards. The color was still sea green. The ships were nymphs of the ocean, girlishly playing among the waves which had formerly scared them. Although they had started their lives as trees on the rock-hard mountains, they haunted the yielding waves without any thought of their birthplace. But none of them ever forgot the many dangers they'd faced and endured on the cruel sea, so their hands would often support any vessels caught in a storm, except those carrying Greeks. They still remembered the sack of Troy and detested the Argives. Their faces lit up with delight when they sighted the fragments of wreckage which came from Ulysses' ship, and were equally glad when they saw Alcinous's bark grow hard with the rock encrusting its timbers. Now that the fleet was transformed into living sea nymphs, the Trojans hoped that Turnus, in fear of this portent, might halt the fighting. But Turnus went on. There were gods on both sides, and, no less important, the men had their courage to help them. They weren't any longer pursuing Lavinia's hand, with the kingdom and throne of her father for dowry. They simply wanted to win, and continued the fight as they felt too ashamed to abandon it now. Eventually Venus saw Aeneas' victory assured, while Turnus fell in the battle. Ardea fell, a powerful city in Turnus's lifetime. After the Trojan torches had razed her walls to the ground, and her ruined buildings were smothered in piles of smoldering ashes, a bird never seen before flew up from the midst of the rubble, lashing the embers with flapping wings. The cries of sorrow, the lean, pale faces, and all that betokens a captured city survived in that bird. Yes, even the name, as the heron called Ardea, beats her wings in her grief for the city from which she arose. Aeneas's courage by now had compelled the gods, including Juno herself, to end the anger they'd nursed so long. Iulus was reaching his prime and his fortunes were firmly established. So Venus's heroic son was ripe for translation to heaven. Venus had canvassed the body of gods, and throwing her arms round Jupiter's neck, had said to him, "Dearest father, you've never been harsh or unyielding to me. Now be at your kindest, I beg you. Please help my Aeneas, your grandson born of our blood divine, and make him a god, no matter how humble, O highest of gods, so long as he joins our ranks. He already has seen the unlovely kingdom of Hades and crossed the Styx. Is once not enough?" The gods all agreed, and even Queen Juno's reaction to Venus was far from impassive. She gave her consent with a gracious smile. Then Jupiter answered his daughter, "This grant of heavenly status is due to Aeneas and you who apply for it. Take what you ask for." Venus was simply delighted and thanked her father profusely. Then riding her chariot, drawn by doves, through the gentle breezes, she duly arrived on the Laurentine coast, where the river Numicius snakes on its course with its mantle of reeds to the neighboring sea. She asked it to wash away whatever parts of Aeneas were subject to death, and silently carry them down to the ocean. The horned god did as Venus commanded, and used his own waters to sprinkle Aeneas and cleanse his nature of all that was mortal, while leaving him all that was best. His mother anointed his purified body with fragrance divine and touched his lips with ambrosia mingled with nectar. She made him a god whom Romulus's people titled Indiges, native, and honored with temple and altars. So Alba and Latium thereafter were under the rule of Iulus, also known as Ascanius. He was succeeded by Silvius, whose son Latinus also came to the throne of the ancient king of the same name. After Latinus, illustrious Alba, Epicus next, and he was followed by Capetus, Capys, though Capys came first, and then Tiberinus, who ruled for a while, but was drowned in a Tuscan stream and gave his name to the river. He had two sons, first Remulus, second the warlike Acrota. The elder, Remulus, tried to mimic the thunder and lightning, and died when struck by a lightning bolt. The more temperate brother, Acrota, handed the kingdom over to brave Aventinus, who reigned on the hill which is called by his name and is where he was buried. At the time of this story, Proca was ruling the Palatine people. Pomona, the goddess of fruits, was one of the dryads of Latium during the reign of this king, and none was more skillful a gardener or more devoted to cultivating the various fruit trees. Hence her name of Pomona. She showed no love for the forests or rivers, but only for orchards and trees with fruit on their branches. She never wielded a hunting spear but a pruning hook, with which she would check luxuriant growth and prevent any branches from spreading too wildly, or else she would use it for splitting the bark to engraft a cutting and offer the sap to an alien shoot. She'd never allow her plants to be thirsty, but watered the greedy roots with trickling channels to feed their flexible fibers. This was her love and her passion. She had no interest in Venus. Indeed, in her fear of assault by some peasant, she fenced her orchard and stayed inside it to shun and forestall all contact with men. What didn't they do to possess her, those lecherous dancers, the satyrs? the Pans with their horns encircled by wreaths of pine, pot-bellied Silenus, who always acted too young for his old man's years, and Priapus, the god who terrifies thieves with his knife or his phallus. One spirit was more in love with Pomona than all of these others, but didn't succeed any better. Vertumnus, the turner, was always appearing in different disguises. He'd come in the garb of a rugged reaper with ears of corn in a trug, and was very convincing. Or else, if you saw the fresh-cut hay in a band on his forehead, you'd think he'd been tossing the new-mown grass like a genuine haymaker. Often he'd carry a goad in his hard, rough hand. You could honestly call him a plowman who'd just unyoked his exhausted oxen. Give him a hook and he might be a pruner or stripper of vines, a ladder to carry, and off he'd be going to harvest the apples. All these forms he adopted again and again to get close to Pomona, and so to enjoy the sight of her beautiful person. One day he even put on a gray wig with a bright-colored headscarf, crouched down over a stick, and pretended to be an old woman. He entered the orchard, admired the apples, and said to Pomona, "They make you all the more tempting," then followed this compliment up by kissing her once or twice on the lips, as a real old woman would never have done. Next, resting her tired bowed back on the earth, the hag looked up at the branches, bowed with the fruits of the autumn. "You see that elm tree?" she said, supporting the beautiful clusters of shiny grapes. "How lovely it looks with the vine it belongs to. Supposing that trunk were a bachelor, without the shoots which entwine it, there'd be no reason, apart from its leaves, to look for its company. So with the vine which happily rests in the arms of the elm tree. Unmarried, it simply would trail on the ground with the earth for its pillow. You, my dear, don't seem to respond to the vine's example. You need to mate, to belong to a man, but you show no interest. If only you would desire it, you'd have more suitors than Helen or Hippodamia, who caused the fight of the Lapiths and Centaurs. Even now, though you shrink and turn from your wooers in loathing, 1,000 men are longing to have you, gods and demigods, all the spirits that make their homes in the Alban hills. Pomona, won't you be sensible? Take an old woman's advice and make a good match. I love you more than all of the others, more indeed than you think. Have nothing to do with those common admirers, but choose Vertumnus to share your bed. You can take my word for his honor. I know him as well as he knows himself. He doesn't wander all over the world in search of new women. He sticks to his own patch. Nor does he fall in love with the latest girl he has seen, like most of your suitors. You'll be his passion, his first and his last. He'll devote his life entirely to you. What's more, he is young and he's blessed by nature with wonderful looks. He can change into any form that he likes to suit the occasion. He'll be whatever you tell him to be, no matter how strange. You like the same things. He's the first to get hold of the apples you grow, and adores to feel them inside his hand. But neither the fruit which is plucked from your trees, nor the succulent grass which grows in your garden. Nothing at all is the slightest interest to him but you. Pity his passion. Imagine your lover is standing before you in person, and speaking through me to implore your bountiful favor. Remember, the gods are vindictive. Unyielding hearts are detested by Venus. Nemesis never forgets, and her wrath is relentless. And now, to add to your fear, since my age has allowed me to know many things, I shall tell you a story familiar all over Cyprus. I hope it will soften your heart and make you more easy to win. Iphis, a youth of inferior birth, had seen Anaxarete, who was a proud princess in the line of Teucer's descendants, and fallen deeply in love. For long he struggled against it, but found he was quite unable to conquer his passion by reason. He therefore went to the lady's house to plead for her pity. He tried to open his bleeding heart to her nurse, whom he earnestly begged, by her hopes for the child she had reared, to show him some kindness. He also attempted to charm each one of the numerous servants, and asked them in anxious tones to lend their weight to his wooing. He'd often present them with sweet love letters to take to their mistress, or else he'd festoon the posts at the palace entrance with garlands, bedewed with his tears, and impetuously throw himself down on the threshold, soft against hard, where he gloomily rained abuse on the door-bolts. But she was more harsh than the rising waves in the stormy season, tougher than iron that is smelted by fire in Norisham's forges, harder than living rock still firmly embedded in earth. She scorned her lover and savagely mocked him. Her merciless deeds were backed by her arrogant words, till even his hopes were extinguished. Iphis could take no more of this cruel protracted torture, and these were the final words that he spoke on his mistress's doorstep. "You win, Anaxarete. No need now to be vexed any more by my wearisome wooing. I'm finished. Enjoy your glorious triumph. Invoke Apollo and wreath your head in glistening laurel. You win, and I gladly die. Be happy then, heart of iron. At least you'll have something to praise in my love, some small satisfaction, something to make you acknowledge my service. Yet always remember, my fondness for you never ended until I had ended my life. In the sun and your eyes I shall lose 2 lights at a single moment. It won't be a rumor that brings you the news of my death. To remove all doubt of it, I shall be there. You will see me in person before you. I want your unfeeling eyes to feast on my lifeless body. O gods, if you look on the actions of mortals, remember poor Iphis. There's nothing else that my feeble tongue has the strength to implore, and ensure that my story is told right down the length of the ages. Restore the years you have taken away from my life to my fame." So speaking, he lifted his streaming eyes and his pale white arms to the parts of the palace doors he had often adorned with his garlands, and said, as he tied a noose to the beams surmounting the entrance, "This garland will give you pleasure, you cruel and faithless girl." He thrust his head, still facing towards her, inside the noose, and at once he was strangled, his luckless body suspended in air. The drum of his quivering feet on the door made a knock, as of someone demanding to enter the house. When the servants answered the summons, they were able to see what had happened, and cried aloud in dismay. They lifted the body out of the halter, but all to no purpose, and carried it back to his mother's threshold. His father was dead. The woman enfolded her son's cold limbs in a loving embrace. Then after she'd uttered her cries and performed her ritual gestures of mourning, she led the gloomy cortege through the heart of the city, bearing the death-pale corpse on a bier to the funeral pyre. By chance, Anaxarete's house was close to the street where the woeful procession was passing. The sounds of lament came through to the ears of the hard princess, whom a vengeful god was already pursuing. Moved, in spite of her nature, she said, "Let us take a look at the funeral train," and climbed aloft to watch through a window. She'd hardly caught sight of Iphis's corpse laid out on the bier, when her eyes glazed over and froze, the warm blood fled from her body, her skin turned horribly pale. She attempted to step right back, but her feet were stuck where they were. Then she tried to avert her gaze and failed once again. Little by little, the stone which had always been there in her hard, cold heart took over the whole of her body. To prove this isn't an idle fiction, Salamis still preserves Anaxarete's statue. It also possesses a shrine dedicated to Venus the Watcher. My dear Pomona, I beg you, remember this story. Abandon your proud, slow-yielding resistance, and give yourself to your lover. If you will take my advice, I shall pray that the frosts in the spring won't nip the buds on your trees, nor the blasts of the wind shake off the fruit when it ripens in autumn. Thus the god, disguised as a crone, appealed to Pomona, but all in vain. He returned to his young man's guise and discarded the old woman's trappings. The vision that now confronted the maid was like the brilliant face of the sun when he clears the obstructing clouds and shines once again with his glory fully revealed. Vertumnus was ready to force his will, but force wasn't needed. The nymph was entranced by his radiant form and responded with passion. Proca was followed as king by Amulius. He had unjustly seized the Ausonian state by force of arms from his brother. Numitor later recovered the throne with the aid of his grandson, Romulus. So, on the feast of Pales, the god of the shepherds, the walls of the city of Rome were founded. A war was then started by Tatius the Sabine, leading the fathers of women abducted by Romulus's men. Tarpeia, who'd opened a path to the fortress, deservedly lost her life as the shields of the enemy crushed her. From there the Sabines, hushed and silent as wolves on the prowl, came down on the Romans while they were dead to the world, and made for the gates of the city, which Ilia's son had firmly secured. But one had been noiselessly turned on its hinges and opened by Juno, and only Venus had noticed the fall of the bars. She'd have closed it, but gods are never allowed to undo the work of each other. Now, close to this gate and to Janus's shrine, the Ausonian naiads lived by an icy spring. When Venus requested their aid, her plea was too just for the nymphs to refuse, and they willingly called on their spring to pour through all of its channels. However, the water had not yet cut off the route which led to the open gateway of two-headed Janus. So yellow sulfur was placed in the gushing spring, and the underground courses were fired with smoking pitch. The heat generated by these and other materials found its way to the depths of the spring, so that waters, which once had competed with alpine cold, were now as hot as a fire can burn. The posts at the temple doors were steaming with flaming spray, and the open gate where the rugged Sabines had vainly been promised an entry by Juno was blocked by this strange new spring, till the Roman soldiers had time to arm. Then Romulus took the offensive, and soon the bodies of Sabines and Romans were strewn on the ground, while fathers whose daughters our people had raped were godlessly shedding the blood of their sons, and sons were shedding the blood of their fathers. But peace was eventually made. They decided not to continue to fight to the end, and the royal power was divided with Tatius. After the death of Tatius, Romulus reigned on his own over Roman and Sabine alike. Then Mars respectfully doffed his helmet and thus addressed the father of gods and of men. My father, since Rome is firmly established on grand foundations and ruled again by a single leader, the time has arrived to pay the reward already promised to me and your worthy grandson by raising him up from the earth to a place in the heavens. May I remind you of words that you spoke long ago in the presence of all the gods in council, those fatherly words that I have faithfully treasured. One man there shall be whom thou wilt uplift to the azure blue of the sky. Now let those words be fulfilled. The omnipotent Father nodded assent. The heavens were veiled in a mantle of clouds, and the world was confounded by thunder and lightning. Mars knew that these signs foreboded his own son's promised translation. He leaned on his spear and fearlessly mounted his chariot, drawn by steeds pressed under his blood-stained yoke. Then he gave them a lash of his cracking whip and glided headlong down through the air till he came to a halt on the top of the wooded Palatine Hill, where Ilia's son was humanely dispensing justice amongst his citizen people, and carried him off. The hero's mortal body dissolved on his upward path as a leaden pellet shot from a broad sling melts away in the midst of the sky. A glorious form took its place, more worthy of gods on their high-placed couches, the form of Quirinus, arrayed in his toga of honor. Hersilie, Romulus's wife, was bewailing her husband as lost, when queenly Juno commanded Iris to follow her rainbow path right down to the earth and to bear the widow these orders. Lady, chief glory of all the Latian and Sabine peoples, most worthy one to have been the wife of so mighty a hero, and now the wife of Quirinus, I bid you cease your lamenting, and if you are still desirous of seeing your late lord, follow me up to the grave on Quirinus's hill, where his temple is shaded by verdant trees. So Iris obeyed, and gliding down to the earth on her rainbow, she brought her Hercylii Juno's message. The woman was bashful and scarcely could raise her eyes, but responded, Goddess, I cannot say who you are, but you must be a goddess. Lead, oh lead me, I pray you, and show me the face of my husband. If fate will allow me only to see him once, I shall boast that I have been lifted to heaven. Post haste, with Iris beside her, she came to Romulus's hill, and there, from above them, a shooting star swooped down to the earth. Her hair ablaze with its fire, Hercylii, joining the star, rose up to the sky, to be welcomed into the long familiar arms of the founder of Rome. He changed her bodily form and also gave her a new name, Hora, so now she's a goddess and one with Quirinus forever.